Hello, welcome to this video. Right, in this video, what we're going to look at is how to provision a K3S Kubernetes cluster with MySQL as the external data store. Alright, so if I search in YouTube for just me K3S, I've done a series of videos on K3S. The one that I'm referring to is Kube 80.1, Rancher K3S, which is a lightweight Kubernetes distribution. I did this video about a year ago where I used one master node and one worker node. So basically a single master K3S Kubernetes cluster, and with single master Kubernetes cluster, K3S uses an embedded SQLite as the data store, but you also have an option to use some external data store like an external HCD cluster. I've done a video on how to set up an external HCD cluster. I'll put a link to that video in the video description, and in this video we're going to be looking at how to use MySQL, specifically MySQL as the external data store. In the previous video, what we did was we used an external HCD cluster as the external data store instead of the embedded SQLite for our K3S cluster, and in this video we're going to be using MySQL. Right, let's get started. So I'm in my play directory and I'm going to git clone my Vagrant repository. Again, I'll put a link to my Vagrant repository in the video description. So if I go to Vagrant and then to Vagrant files, I have this Ubuntu 20 folder where I have the Vagrant file. Right, let's take a look at the Vagrant file. It's quite simple. Just Ubuntu virtual machine. Node count is 2. Depending on how many nodes you want, you can change this variable. Either you can use VirtualBox as the provider or libvirt as the provider. I'm going to be using libvirt as my Vagrant provider. I'm going to bring up KVM virtual machines for this demo. Right, so the virtual machines will have one CPU and 1 gig of RAM. Let me first bring up these virtual machines. So I'm going to do Vagrant up -- provider libvirt, and if you're using VirtualBox, just do Vagrant up. That will use VirtualBox provider as the default. Alright, so our two virtual machines have been provisioned, and if I show virsh list, so we have our two virtual machines, and I also have a bootstrap script. And if I show you the bootstrap script, it enables password authentication on the Ubuntu virtual machines and also sets the root password to admin. That's all I'm doing in my bootstrap script. Okay, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start a MySQL Docker container on my host machine. So I have this docker run command, basically docker run -d in the background, giving it a name, and I'm mapping port 3306 inside the container to 3306 on my host machine. So all the virtual machines on my host can access 3306 via my host machine and get into the MySQL container. And I'm setting the initial MySQL root password to password. And MySQL database, I'm just creating an empty database called Kubernetes, and I'm also creating a user called kubeadmin with the password. I'm using MySQL tag 8. Alright, that's running Docker PS, that's fine. And I also have MySQL client installed on my Arch Linux. So basically I can do MySQL -host 127.0.0.1, and it's going to connect to 3306 port. That will direct the traffic to the container, and the password for root is password. Okay, show schemas, and I have Kubernetes, which got created when I ran the docker run command. And if I use Kubernetes show tables, it's an empty database at the moment. Let's exit out of it. Alright, so we have our MySQL database running as a container, and now we are good to set up the K3S Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so let me log into the master node, which is 172.16.16.101. The password is admin. Alright, so we are inside our Kubernetes master node where we are going to use K3S to install or provision our Kubernetes cluster. So for that, I'm going to refer to the K3S documentation. If I search for Rancher K3S, lightweight Kubernetes Rancher K3S, and I'm going to look at the installation options. So there are a couple of ways to install K3S Kubernetes cluster. One is through this installation script. It's a handy script, but I would recommend anything of this sort, don't do it in your machine unless you had a look at what the script is actually going to do. You need to be a root user in order to run this script, but make sure to download the script and have a look at what it's actually going to do before blindly running these type of scripts. So that's one way of provisioning K3S cluster, and the other way is also to download the K3S binary from the GitHub releases page, but I'm going to stick with this script approach because that's what I used in my video Cube 80.1, so I'm going to stick with that, the same process, but instead of using embedded SQLite, we're going to be using MySQL as the external data store. So let's start copying this command. I'm going to paste this in a text editor because I need to be passing in few other options before actually running this command on the master node. Okay, so we're downloading the script, and before executing it we need to set certain environment variables. So if I go to the documentation, there is this variable that you can use, install K3S exec. Basically any options you're going to pass to the K3S command line, you can add that to this install K3S exec variable. Okay, so the options that I'm interested in are, if I go to server configuration reference, and if I look at the K3S server CLI help, I'm just interested in looking at what options might be useful in my case. So one thing to note is, in my virtual machine, if you look at the network interface configuration, I have two network interfaces, ETH0 and ETH1. Okay, ETH1 is the default one, and ETH1 is the private network that I would like to use in my Kubernetes cluster, which I've given a specific IP range. In this case, it's 172.16.16.101, and I have to change the interface that I want to use for my Kubernetes cluster. So there is an option here called Flannel interface. By default, we will be using Flannel as the overlay network, and if you don't pass this option, by default it will be using the first available network interface, which I don't want to use. I want to use this specific ETH1 network interface. So I need to use this option --flannel minus interface and set that to ETH1, and then I also need to specify the node IP. If I don't specify the node IP, the Kuberium init or the cluster will be using by default this IP address. So again, I need these two options, --, node IP. Let's copy that, and before that we need this environment variable. Okay, install K3S exec. So let's paste that. Okay, so in order to make this readable, I'm going to make that into a multiple line so that we can follow this easily. Okay, so the option that I'm going to paste in is, the first option is the node IP. Copy and paste it here. Node IP is 172.16.16.101, and the second option is the Flannel interface. Copy and paste. Flannel interface is ETH1. So what else I need? So that's fine. So now by default, if I run this command, it's going to use the embedded SQL as the data store, but I want to use the external MySQL as the external data store, which I've already got. I've got a MySQL container running, and I want to use that as an external data store. So I need to pass in additional options. So if I show you, there are a few things that you can use. Data store endpoint, so that is going to tell whether you're going to use etcd, MySQL or Postgres as your external data store. So I need to use this option. So basically I can use this option inside the install K3S exec, and all these options will get passed on to the K3S binary. But to keep things simple, I'm also going to, instead of adding that to this command line, I'm going to export that as a separate environment variable. Okay, let's look at the documentation. So we have, if I go to cluster data store options, data store endpoint. So instead of --, data store endpoint, passing that as an argument to the CLI, you can also export this variable. Okay, so let's copy that, paste it here, equals. So our data store endpoint is going to be the connection string for our MySQL database. Alright, so we will have an example for that as well. Data store endpoint format and functionality. So select MySQL and the format has to be like this. So let's copy that, paste it here. So our database name is Kubernetes, which is what we created. It's an empty database at the moment. And host name is, I'm running the Docker container, the MySQL Docker container in my host machine as a Docker container. So I need to paste in the IP address of my host machine, which is 192.168.0.15. And the username is kubeadmin, and the password is password. So that's the command that I need to be running. Let's copy that. And in here, let's run this command. So it basically downloads the K3S binary from GitHub, and then it installs a bunch of scripts, creates some certain directories, and it should not take more than 30 seconds. It should be relatively quick. So it's downloading Kubernetes version 1.21.5, starting K3S as a systemd service. It should be running fine. Okay, systemctl status K3S. K3S service is running fine, and we should now be able to interact with our Kubernetes cluster. kubectl get nodes. Yep, so we have one node which is the control plane. kubectl cluster info. kubectl cluster info. Okay, so everything is looking fine then. Alright, so we have our cluster running. We can add worker node or K3S agent to this cluster. At the moment, this cluster consists of just one master node, but I'm not going to add worker node. It's just exactly the same thing that I've explained in this video, Kube 80.1. But how do we make sure that this Kubernetes cluster is actually connecting to the external HCD? So I'm on this master node. If I do ps -ef grep for HCD, there is no HCD process running on this machine. ps -ef, if I grep for SQLite, there is no SQLite. So kubectl get pods-a, there is no static HCD pods. Then how do we know which data store it's connecting to? So we know it's connecting to the MySQL as the external data store, and if I exit out of it and if I log into MySQL now with the password and use Kubernetes database show tables, and now we have this kind table. If I describe this kind table, so we have all these data. So instead of using HCD as the data store, now we are using MySQL as the data store. And basically I can run commands like select name from kind limit 10. Right, as you can see here, all these are Kubernetes resources. So when the K3S Kubernetes service, systemd service started, it used MySQL as the external data store. It copied all the configurations, all the key values to the external MySQL. So this is how you use MySQL as the external data store. If you want, you can also use Postgres as the external data store. The concept is very similar. You need to have your Postgres running somewhere, and you need to use the K3S data store endpoint for the Postgres. Again, if you want to use Postgres, there is options here, Postgres, and this is the connection string format for Postgres. It's very similar to MySQL, and we have it here. Cool, I think that's all I wanted to show you, and hope you found this useful. Let me know if you've got any questions. I'll be happy to help, and I think that's it. I will see you all in my next video. Until then, keep learning and keep on learning. Bye-bye.